Take a piece of America back.
It's called truth. It's called truth. Truth.
We the last of the vintage flow as we carry it on our shoulders. I keep my friends close and them devils a lot closer. When the freedom riders approach them, they appetize for votes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the next edition of Altered Boy Podcast. It's brought to you by The Last American Vagabond. We're going to dive right in here. Today we're going to be talking about the corruption in the comic book industry. For those who aren't familiar with the context of the corruption that has been going on in the media, well, there's no other word for it, the conspiracy of the manipulation of the media. It goes a lot further than people just buying mainstream media sources. And for anyone who is familiar with Dave McGowan's work, Weird Seeds Inside the Canyon, and Jan Irvin / Joe Atwill's work of Gnostic Media, talking about the Tavistock relationship to the Grateful Dead, as well as the Grateful Dead's relationship to MK Ultra, LSD, etc. It all has a very ominous overtone. And long story short, I figured that being a massive comic book fan as a kid, I would likely stumble across this type of corruption on some level in the comic book industry. And lo and behold, I did. It's not exactly CIA MK Ultra status. I'll go ahead and burst that bubble for you right there. But this is a beautiful example of how elitism runs the media, basically. And what happened is this didn't start out as an MK Ultra machination, because this was, we're dealing with the 1920s here. This was before the CIA. And once the CIA came around, they pretty much were picked up at that point. Now, as an industry as a whole, but definitely insurgents, and I don't use that term lightly, it's very literal. And today, with the Disney corporate buyout of Marvel Comics, and just kind of like DC and everyone else really following in suit, just trying to capitalize on the industry, it really has become nothing more than a shell industry of the CIA. So anyway, we'll dive into the history here, and I'll elaborate on how I came to those conclusions, because it's actually pretty self-explanatory. I was surprised that no one had flushed this out yet. And again, this is an open source investigation. I'm using links and material that you yourself can check out, and I am not using any insider tips here. So this starts in 1906 in Chicago, even though most of this is based in New York City. A little prequel, if you will, in Chicago with the likes of Moses L. Annenberg, who was an up-and-coming wealthy media mogul in the distributing market with Pulp Fiction magazines and news magazines, and he actually, let's see, what was it? He developed Chicago Newsstand. He upstarted that, and was quickly conjoined. There's another word I'm thinking of, but that works, in partnership with William Randolph Hearst, where he was, if I remember correctly, inserting pamphlets of William Randolph Hearst's political stuff into his regularly distributed material of the variety of what he was doing. And when I say he, I'm talking about Annenberg as opposed to Hearst. Hopefully that was obvious. And by the way, I should have also mentioned that it is on record that, and not of dispute at all, that being Russian Jewish immigrants, Mo Annenberg and his brother Max quickly turned to crime in Chicago. And again, I hope this goes without saying, but the emphasis there is not on the Russian Jewish part being a relationship to crime, but the immigrant part, new into the country, kind of like not born, but thrust into poverty at an early age, especially in Chicago. Right, so they started running with the likes of Dean O'Banion, who was an old school, big time gangster in Chicago, who eventually became the arch rival of Al Capone when he stepped on the scene. They were really receiving lots of benefits with mafia money laundering, and as well as their regular business revenue. But when Al Capone stepped on the scene, that caused a lot of strife and a lot of turf warfare. That's classic Chicago mafia gang warfare. Really, really poignant time in that city's history. And so Annenberg actually, he already had some established ties in New York City. And when business started getting a little rougher for him in Chicago, he wasn't in himself in any necessary like specific danger. And there is evidence to show that he eventually became pretty cool with Capone as well. But business connections were definitely like things were getting jammed up. So they moved to New York City, or not like they started moving their business attention to New York City, I should say. One of his major connections and glimpses, other than his convictions, into his organized crime ties, Annenberg, his ownership of the Daily Racing Tab, which was a just a publication about horse racing and like the legal gambling circuits in New York City. And I'll read this quote: "Anti-racketeering prosecutors targeted the National Wire Service of Moses Annenberg because they considered it the lifeblood of the gambling industry that nourished American gangsters. At that time, gambling was controlled in New York City by a partnership of three mobsters: Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Arnold Rothstein. It is hard to imagine how Moses Annenberg gained control of a nationwide monopoly of racetrack wire services without their complicity." So there's a lot. There's going to be a lot of little things that stack up like that, and that's just the beginning. And I also wanted to say, I should have said this at the beginning, where I'm getting a lot of this information is combing through an information database by the name online by the name of Field Guide to Wild American Pulp Artists, which is ran by David Saunders in New York City. And this guy, I didn't actually have any contact with him, but kudos to you, David. I really appreciate your work, because even though he wasn't actually he wasn't trying to expose any conspiracies or anything, in his detailed depiction of this era and the characters in this era, he really laid out a lot of things plain and simple, and just needed to connect the dots. And so what this guy, the types of museums that this guy curates, are museums related to the heritage and continuation of contemporary art. And David Saunders' late relative, Norman Saunders, was one of the most prolific Pulp Fiction cover artists of the era, and worked with a lot of the greats, companies, authors, and characters. And like I say, this thing, Field Guide to Wild American Pulp Artists, is basically like an online museum of information. This is primary source material, is what I'm saying. So anyway, now that I've explained where a lot of these, pretty much any of these quotes are coming from, unless I say otherwise. So just a reminder, we were talking about Annenberg and the Daily Racing Tab and syndicated crime ties there. And meanwhile, in New York City, in 1924, Warren Angel and Paul Sampliner set up Eastern Distributing Company. And this is under the conglomerated umbrella of the American News Company. That is basically part of the mainstream mechanism and the originations when we're talking about this era. Warren Angel has his own shady dealings. He was known as a serial small-time con artist and was implicated in some court cases. Paul Sampliner had a bit more of a clean record. But as we will see with the likes of upcoming character Harry Donenfeld, they clearly had some more serious ties. So I'll read this quote from the field guide, says, in 1924, Mo L. Annenberg organized production of 6 million promotional brochures for distribution as inserts in Hearst publications. Surprisingly, the vendor chosen for this massive project was Harry Donenfeld, a salesman at Marlin Printing, who was neither a printer nor an owner of a press. His only qualification was the trust of Max Marlin, Theodore Epstein, and Frank Costello. This lucrative contract was the first big break for Harry Donenfeld. To handle such a project, he formed Elmo Press, Incorporated, which he listed as a printer of, quote, magazines and newspapers. Although legal documents named his wife and brother-in-law as partners, there's a distinct echo in the name Elmo of Moel, as in Moel Annenberg. Another curious note was the 1924 NYC Business Directory listed the company at 32nd West 22nd Street. That was the same address as the Tab Printing Corporation, where Theodore Epstein produced the Daily Racing Tab in affiliation with Moel Annenberg. Again, another connection that Moses Annenberg is setting up, and where that takes us is Harry Donenfeld's heavy syndicated distributive connections with none other than Eastern Distributing Company. So I think it's pretty obvious there. Again, these are highlights. I could go into a lot more details about their relationships, but honestly, that's pretty dry. And again, I am just trying to make a basic outline for people who are interested in this narrative. We see the unfolding of the business and the relationships that syndicated crime has here with this Pulp Fiction distributing. And again, it's not just Pulp Fiction. They're doing a lot of other things at this point as well. I want to read another quote here because we're gonna dive in to a little bit of Capone's connection in this. A quote: on Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1929, the remaining 7 members of Dean O'Banion's North Side Gang were murdered. Shocking photographs of the carnage were featured in nationwide newspapers as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. 2 weeks later, Al Capone visited Philadelphia. If the goal of his trip was to forestall further reprisals to Philadelphia area, the nearby Atlantic City was a likely place to bury the hatchet, quote unquote. He was arrested for carrying a concealed weapon and released 1 week later. He then traveled to his home in Miami Beach, Florida, and hosted an impressive celebration party, which was attended by Ned Brown, William Cafoed, and his twin brother Jack Cafoed, all 3 of whom were journalists at the newspapers owned by Moses Annenberg. So we see that these guys are well connected. And as ties continue in New York City magazine distribution, we had 1928. By 1928, DCs are really starting to blossom and flower. And Eastern Distributing hires what I call its third musketeer by the name of Louis Silbercleat. And this guy actually ended up becoming the co-founder of Archie Comics. And the reason I bring up Silbercleat is because he actually ended up hiring an intern by the name of Martin Goodman. Martin Goodman went on to upstart Timely Comics, which became Marvel. Warren Angel eventually left Eastern Distributing to have his own success in Pulp Fiction companies, other distributing companies. Eastern Distributing was eventually conglomerated by American News Company, and which became AmCorp. And that just kind of became assimilated from there. And Paul Sampliner went on to co-found Independent News and Comics, which eventually became DC Comics. And he founded that with none other than Harry Donenfeld, which has some pretty obvious long-standing business relationships with Annenberg. And I think that it's not really very much of an assumption to say that you don't really have any business relationships with Harry Donenfeld unless you are also working with Annenberg. But I was trying to remember what the CIA was before it was the CIA, basically. And it's the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, and that's upcoming because up until this point, the OSS, was doing its thing, but it wasn't as prevalent as the CIA is today by any means. And so this comic book industry was largely run by organized crime, like mafia crime. And the next chapter, as we're going to be wrapping up the mafia crime here, the next chapter dives a bit more into the alphabet agencies. So we do have those definite connections to certain New York crime, and by further deduction from there, although this would take stuff like actual digging into libraries and whatnot. So I would be interested in doing that, but again, there's only so much time, and I'm just giving a general overview. The gangsters that would further be implicated, if not literally in this case, they would definitely, their networks of like the crime that they facilitated would definitely, just by empirical deduction, these would be the most likely areas of finding more dirt on the connection between organized crime and the comic book industry. And again, I'll touch on this a little bit later, but a lot of these people were convicted, like specifically Annenberg. So there isn't really a debate, but the specifics could be fleshed out even more. So some of these classical gangsters involved would be Bugsy Siegel, however you pronounce that, Meyer Lansky, Lepke Buchalter, and Jacob Shapiro. And again, if you don't recognize those names, they are pretty classical, old school gangsters, and they were involved in labor racketeering and alcohol bootlegging. Those are basically the two main avenues that the comic book and pulp fiction, magazine distributing little network that these guys had going on. That's how they helped launder money for these gangsters and mafia networks. It was number one through labor racketeering, and number two through alcohol bootleg money laundering through the labor racketeering, basically through the labor unions. And again, that's more of a cross analysis. That's my overall analysis, because they were convicted in some cases, but like I say, to say that they were doing it the whole time, not necessarily on record, and I am making that assertion because it seems really friggin' obvious based off the primary source material. Okay, so since we tied that up a little bit, we understand where a lot of these old school organized crime connections are coming from. I mentioned that Eastern Distributing Company was broken up and eventually branched off into Archie Comics. It's interesting how Eastern Distributing branched into Archie, DC, and Marvel Comics in one way or another. So I don't think that is by coincidence either. I mean, these guys clearly had prominent ties and were put in positions to use those ties. So at Timely Comics, just for a little bit of historical context, Martin Goodman churns out characters like Namor, the Submariner, and the pre-Fantastic Four Human Torch, and Captain America, which was definitely on record having statist OSS ties. Like that wasn't even a dispute. That was entirely acknowledged the entire time. Next up, for anyone who is a massive Stan Lee fan, where he comes in is he is none other than the cousin by marriage of Martin Goodman. So he was not blood, but he was definitely in the family. I mean, that's pretty much the same thing when you're dealing with these elitist networks. And along with Jack Kirby, Stan Lee has created Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Incredible Hulk, Iron Man, X-Men, the Avengers, Daredevil. It goes on and on. So obviously, I mean, it should go without saying that this guy is a cornerstone of the comic book industry. And actually, I was surprised to find this out, but apparently this is a well-acknowledged factoid of the comic book industry in Jack Kirby. But Jack Kirby actually did a little bit of work for the CIA. Dun, dun, dun. No, he wasn't an agent, but he had an affiliation with them. For anyone who remembers, or just at least remembers reading about the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, where diplomats were held hostage in Iran. Long story short, Kirby was creating artwork to develop a science fiction theme park that never went. The CIA was trying to find a way to covertly rescue these diplomats, and so they used this science fiction novel that was popular and really complex because they didn't want people diving into the script too much, allegedly. So they wanted to just pick something super heady and far out there. I'll have links for all this, but I don't like remember the book's name or anything. But this is all heavily documented. And so they combined Kirby's concept sketches for this science fiction theme park and this crazy science fiction novel, and the CIA created a false movie production company and rescued the diplomats. It's debatable how much Kirby actually played a role in that, but he was clearly contacted by the CIA, and so that doesn't make him a bad guy or anything. But that just shows one of the paper thin veils, as I say in the article I wrote about this, between media and intelligence communities. And so, speaking of this paper thin veil, not necessarily with intelligence, but just these elitist networks in general. Again, another shout out to Jan Irvin at Gnostic Media. In one of his articles, he actually references the X-Men, which is pretty cool because it's not an article about the X-Men. It's a total side note, and I was very stoked to use this as a little excerpt in the article. So I'm going to go ahead and read the article I wrote on this here. The more ominous notes of peculiarity in no particular sequence was the inspiration behind the name for the X-Men. Largely unknown to fans, this X moniker stems from the infamous Huxleyan X Club, which was an entirely real-life group of Darwinian eugenicist scientists helmed by Thomas Huxley, which served to directly influence the scientific community into what it is known in academia to be today. These were literally, this is not an embellishment. These were the people who pushed for the normalization of Darwinism and Charles Darwin's ideas in modern science. It was the X Club. And it was an excuse for eugenics. I mean, I'm not necessarily claiming that Darwin himself was a total eugenicist, but I mean, the Huxleys clearly were. That's a whole different rabbit hole. So look into the X Club. So I'll read a quote from Jan's research at Gnostic Media. It says, "My investigation into Thomas Henry Huxley's background, grandfather to Aldous and Julian, reveals him as the key promoter of Darwin's theories, who was his friend and teacher, and through Huxley's X Club, they created academics who would promote Darwin's ideas. Not coincidentally, spin-offs of this X Club include the X-Men comic series on eugenics and evolution, and for Fourth World Comics on mind control by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, the Fourth World being tied to the UN's Agenda 21. Jan also mentions the possibility that, which is a little bit more tenuous, but also interesting, that the whole slang from ecstasy comes from kind of culling of the masses because, X taking them out. MDMA, in certain cases, if you're really jacked up, if you're sexually abused as a child, I think MDMA is positive in a certain psychotherapeutic environment, but it's not really good for you in any other circumstances. So definitely not recommend snorting any Molly, guys. All right, so moving on here. Before I drop the whole Stan Lee thing, I also wanted to mention, I found this out after the fact, so I had to update the article. For those who don't know, I wasn't even aware of this until I had to do some research. Stan Lee Media, after he left Marvel, was a total clusterfuck. I'll just go ahead and read this little piece I have from the article, paraphrasing. Just use it as some bullet points here. There's an incredibly well-known and entangled court case involving Peter F. Paul and Stan Lee, both of Stan Lee Media, which was the company that Lee began developing with what was ultimately fraudulent financial backing. So these the dot-com bubble inflation, and basically used, I might not be using totally correct terminology, but they used the capital projected in the market by Stan Lee's name and like what his material and what his name was worth in the market. They took that like theoretical financial backing and basically, again, overgeneralizing it a little bit, made that as real financial backing on paper. And Peter F. Paul actually went to jail for this. And apparently, I didn't look into this part too much, but he also had convictions of conspiracy and drug dealing. So apparently, that guy was in all sorts of stuff. So clearly, Stan Lee Media, since we don't hear about it anymore, I didn't really ever do anything. And there's also some shady dealings between Peter Paul and his money from Stan Lee Media and the Hillary Clinton Senate campaign of 2000. So all sorts of stuff there. Surprise, surprise, you find Hillary Clinton here in comic book scandals by proxy. All right, so at this point, I'm going to wrap it up a little bit. And I'm just going to talk more about some interesting ties that the comic book industry has in general to all sorts of nonsense. I mean, obviously, we're dealing with such a vast array of different concepts and companies and networks. We're just kind of like dipping our toes in and going all around, circling the water's edge a little bit. And I'm just showing you how far this thing goes with all sorts of little tidbits here and there. So since I just fucking slashed up Marvel a little bit, I'm gonna go after the jugular of DC. And for those unfamiliar, Alan Moore, legendary author of Watchmen, Batman: The Killing Joke, V for Vendetta, and even From Hell, which is the graphic novel about Jack the Ripper. He was a practitioner of Thelema, Aleister Crowley's Thelema, and the occult in general. And for anyone who's reads my work, I am the first one to admit both sides of Crowley. He did some completely horrendous things, and he also did some very positive things. Even if you want to argue that he never had an altruistic thought in his entire life, his work still inevitably produced a lot of good. And that's a completely different story, and I'm not advocating Crowley, but I'm advocating if anyone wants to look into his work, they will not be disappointed, because the mechanics for good and evil are the same. The context is different. So I'm not necessarily saying Alan Moore was a terrible person, but he could have been. He could have been. And he used all of this occultism throughout his material, and it's obvious, especially with stuff like Watchmen and From Hell. But speaking of Batman, that's actually had a lot of occult attention. Anyone familiar with Grant Morrison's advocation of chaos magic? Which, again, I don't necessarily think Grant Morrison's a terrible person. I like chaos magic for its roots in chaos theory, which is not inherently evil. It's a scientific principle. But again, that just shows because Morrison is a legendary comic author, and he clearly used a lot of occult inspiration in his comics. So Batman's always received a lot of occult attention. And as if he hadn't received enough attention, Tom King, who is a new hotshot comic book author for Batman of DC and the Vision of Marvel Comics, the Vision being that red, crazy robot cyborg thing. I never got into Vision too much from Avengers. And who is Tom King? Well, he's a fancy comic book author that just decided to settle down into comic books after an entire career as a high-ranking CIA field agent. Yeah. Does anybody need to be reminded of all the crazy shit that Disney is involved with? Their transhumanist agenda, MK Ultra, and look at all their stars, the mental fortitude of a lot of the people involved with Disney. The fact that Disney was totally pro-Nazi and even had Wernher von Braun on a lot of his TV shows or like films in general and stuff. If anyone needs any more food for thought about Disney, consider the Avengers. Well, first off, does anyone remember the first Iron Man where he literally funded the moderate rebels and then it got into the hands of the extremists who kidnapped him? I mean, come on, people. Holy fucking hell. So Iron Man is a weapons arms dealer who funded Al-Qaeda, which became ISIS. And then we also have a bunch of intelligence agents. We have all the alphabet agencies working with the superheroes with S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Western Surveillance State, which is S.H.I.E.L.D. teaming up with Captain America, who might as well be called Captain Propaganda. And we have Hawkeye and Black Widow, both CIA agents. And we even have, granted, this is a little more far fetched, but I don't really think it's that far fetched. We have the idea of the Hulk and Bruce Banner being a sort of transhumanist, Monsanto esque fuel genetic tampering thing. And then, of course, lest we not forget the entire North mythology. So, and does anyone remember the Tesseract, the glowing cube that is traditional in Luciferian mythology and Freemasonic philosophy? And again, Luciferian being the Promethean archetype, not necessarily evil, but like these people. I mean, it's just sitting right there, everybody. Just look at it. I also wanted to say that if for anyone familiar with Ed Brubaker, this guy is won lots of awards like Eisner and other stuff. But he's popular for Batman and Catwoman. He wrote a lot of Captain America. Like anyone who remembers the death of Captain America, which came out like I don't know, might have been like a decade at this point, but it doesn't seem that long ago. That was really popular. He also did work with Daredevil, and he's done other stuff. Yeah, he's won apparently 3 Eisner Awards and 2 Harvey Awards for Best Writers. This guy's all over the place, very esteemed. Well, I'll just read a quote from him from CBR.com. This is an actual quote. I've always been fascinated with the espionage world in general. My dad was in naval intelligence, and my uncle was a big mucky muck at the CIA in the 60s and 70s. And so I was always, as a little kid, being around at weird cocktail parties full of spies and military people and things like that. Um, oh man, I'll just cite Dave McGowan and Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. So again, I know this might have been a little jumpy for people, kind of like all over the place, but no one else is talking about it. Not to say I blame anybody. It's not exactly current news, breaking news, and no one would really be looking into this unless such as myself, are super interested in used to be interested in comic books. And I mean, I'm one of those dudes who still has boxes even after I sold a lot of them. So I still have a Spider-Man poster on my wall just for old time's sake. What I want to leave everybody with is the idea that we don't need to completely forsake everything that we cherished as children. And actually, this is kind of like a codex to understanding ourselves and the pitfalls, because even though these were given to us by the media, it's still our brain operates. They're still, as I just explained, with all the symbolism that actually comes. Well, I didn't explain it too much, but I alluded to it. They're actually using real symbolism and archetypes and stuff. So you can use this to dive into, if you really, really go fully down the rabbit hole, you can get into psychotherapy. I'll share just a really minor anecdote. I won't go into too many details, but I remember being 18 and flipping through The Crow by J.O. Barr. It was the graphic novel that Bruce Lee's son made the movie about in the 90s, and then he died during the shooting of it. Great movie, way better comic book. Pretty dark, but like very poetic and inspiring. So I really liked that one as a kid. And I remember flipping through it when I was 18 or 19 and being like, now mind you, my life isn't that dark or anything. It was a metaphor. But I saw a lot of just like things that I don't even necessarily remember, but just like metaphors. I didn't even realize until I took an objective perspective how much I related to the story and other stories, because this didn't just happen with The Crow. There's other comic books and lots of like classical literature as well. And it was basically a peek into how archetypes help shape who we are. And they're not necessarily being entirely force fed to you, because you're going through the process of formulating these thoughts, but they could be a lot more authentic. And once we understand that process, we can kind of branch out from there. It's a lot of an unlearning process and a relearning process. So it's just a stepping stone. That's what we should, take all these things as video games and weird music that turns out to be weird in retrospect, and comic books, and we got to live life too. We got to enjoy ourselves, but it's really important to understand the underlying mechanisms of the things that surround us. Again, check out thelastAmericanVagabond.com. Thanks for listening, everybody. Check out my article and for a slightly more detailed analysis, a bit more of a structured walkthrough. And again, this is definitely something that could use more fleshing out. So I'll look into that a bit more. And I encourage anyone else to look into it as well. It's a fun line of research, and it doesn't get into a lot, any, as far as I know yet, any satanic pedophilia, etc., shit like that. So it's a bit more lighthearted overall, I would say. So anyway, thanks so much, guys. Keep fighting the good fight out there. And remember that we're all living in a quantum holographic simulation, and it's all based on social response. So it's really important to help a brother out. It sounds cheesy, but really just pay it forward. There's no time like the present. And stand up for yourself, but help those who help you. All right, everybody. Take care, and next time you go and check out those comic books, hopefully you have a different perspective on the matter. All right. Peace.